Hello, my name is Jean Kropper. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and today I'm interviewing Cynthia Phelps, PhD, founder of InnerAlly. Dr. Phelps is a Stanford Ambassador of Compassion, international speaker, certified mindfulness instructor, and founder of InnerAlly. InnerAlly is a trauma-informed company building tools, courses, and mobile apps to improve mental wellness based on the science of self-compassion. She has extensive experience in learning and behavior change and has been developing mental health tools since 2009. Her expertise is in helping people to use their inner voice as their superpower to get what they want out of life. Many of us have a critical inner voice that undermines our confidence. Cynthia helps you turn this around. Her background in pharmacology and neuroscience helps her create programs and products for effective health behavior change. Cynthia started InnerAlly after having a profound experience recovering from alcoholism by implementing self-compassion in her own life. Now she facilitates live, online training, and private programs to help others to make their own breakthroughs. InnerAlly celebrates the power of creating a kind and supportive inner voice to change your life for the better. I'm very glad to have Cynthia here to talk to us today. Hello, Cynthia.
Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, well, this is terrific. Now, I understand you're in Asheville, North Carolina, in the eastern US. What's Asheville like?
Oh, Asheville is a lovely city. This is the only place in my lifetime that I've moved on purpose.
Ah, okay, yes.
It's not to go for a job or schooling or, something else. And this is a city that's full of artists and full of healers and full of outdoors people. It's a mountain city. So
Okay.
we're right near the Appalachian Trail, if you might, that might
Yes,
translate there.
yes.
And
My
so
brother hiked along that when he was in his teens and 20s. So yes, yeah.
it's so beautiful. And so it's a very lovely place to be. And I feel like I fit in for once.
Yep, I understand. I understand. Yeah. Did you grow up there?
I grew up in Michigan in a suburb of Detroit, and I did my schooling in Michigan. Then I was in Texas for quite some time. I worked at the Health Science Center as my first job in Houston, Texas.
Oh, right. Okay. Interesting. Yes, I passed through Houston in November. All right. And before we dive into what you're doing now, I'd like to ask about your background. What's a Stanford Ambassador of Compassion?
Doesn't that sound fancy?
It does. It does. It sounds wonderful. Yes.
Well, Stanford is kind of the epicenter of research when it comes to compassion, mindfulness, and altruism. And they have a center called the Center for Compassion, Altruism Research, Education, and Education, CCARE.
Mhm.
And this is headed up by a man named Dr. Doty, who is James Doty. He is a best-selling author, but he is also a neurosurgeon,
Mhm.
and he is kind of the Mr. Compassion, if you will. He's the type of person who hangs out with the Dalai Lama and
Okay.
all kinds of amazing spiritual leaders from all paths. And interestingly enough, he is an atheist,
Mm.
but he is very dedicated to the science of compassion. And so this is his center and his program. And I did a 11-month program that walked through the science of compassion. And it's really for people around the world that want to utilize the science of compassion to make the world a better place.
How interesting. Okay, great. I understand you've worked as a professor in health information science. Is that meaning
Yeah.
you were teaching people how to use tech to change behavior, or just tell me some more about that?
Well, I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship in neuroscience, and I was studying learning at the time. And I was actually doing it at a cellular level. I was listening to one neuron talk to another neuron in the laboratory. So
Hmm.
very much bench science. And this was right about when internet browsers were born, and the internet became a visual way to navigate around. Before, it was all just typing in strings of searches and such.
Hmm.
And when I saw that, I just knew that this was a moment in time where the world was changing rapidly and that this was going to be the way that everybody learned in the future. And so at that moment in time, I began to change my career and moved it towards how do I study technology and utilizing these new tools coming out, and what does that look like for helping people to learn. And then later on, I ended up got brought on as faculty to a brand new school that was being developed, the School of Health Information Science. Informatics was like the thing. And we were kind of combining computer science and cognitive science and health sciences all together. And they wanted to have a component of that had to do with learning. And then it just turned out our School of Public Health was upstairs. And so that's where the behavior change kind of came in. Some of those partners, I was real interested in what they were doing because they were interacting a lot with the public and informing the public of, you know, health behaviors. And so they were fascinated with technology as well at the time.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. And so you were working to understand sort of learning and behavior change. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, okay, all right. So that would be useful certainly when helping other change bad habits.
Oh, for sure.
That's sort of the essence of it. Yeah, okay. And you're a certified mindfulness instructor. I understand mindfulness, but tell me a bit more about the program and what are sort of the skills or processes that you were teaching as part of that.
Right. It was a very specific type of mindfulness that I was trained in, and it's called mindful self-compassion. And it is a program, a research-based program. It's very similar to Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is an 8-week research-based program to help reduce stress, where this is an 8-week research-backed program to be able to increase your levels of self-compassion, which is associated with all kinds of amazing, yummy outcomes, like more innovation and productivity, less depression, anxiety, less risk for addiction, and just more happiness, well-being. Like it kind of sounds like a snake oil.
Yep.
But the research is all there. And so
Okay. Yep.
that it really hooked me because I had a moment when I first found out about it, because I was really struggling in my life at the time. I had gone through like this period of really intense loss, and I didn't have any therapy. I didn't have any tools to be able to deal with that level of loss. And I had just started turning to alcohol because I was in so much pain and I had no idea like how to dig myself out of it. And that is when I ran across the research on self-compassion. And it was kind of like, oh, the clouds parted. And all of a sudden I was like, this is what I'm missing. You know, this is what I'm really missing in my life. And that got me down the path, like kind of turned my trajectory from just looking at technology and learning and behavior change. I was already interested in mental health and doing some mental health things. But then it really shifted more towards this emerging field at the time, which was called positive psychology. And so what that means is, instead of, as a psychologist, you used to, if you were a researcher, you were studying sick people. Right. People who had disorders, and then you're trying to figure out how to make them well. Well, positive psychology was looking at people who were thriving and then figuring out how to reverse engineer that for everybody else, right? And so
yeah, it's always quite different when you need to apply things to yourself as well. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, and it's one thing, it's wonderful to cure disease and to help disorders and that kind of thing. But like us regular people too, just need some help to be a little happier or a little more productive or a little more whatever it is that you're seeking, right?
Yeah. Now you said you went through a time of loss. Can you tell me a bit about that? I mean, that often is the worst time, but also can spark growth later when you're figuring out how to get out of that. But tell us first about what was happening at that time.
Yeah, I had a childhood, which I think it's somewhat common I was raised in kind of a 1950s style household, even though it was the 60s and 70s, really. My parents were very kind of old school in that, like, my father was, I don't show emotion. And then my mother just kind of went along with that whole thing. And I didn't really get the type of emotional tools
Mm,
that I really kind of needed. And I was born this little sensitive, like curious young person.
mm,
And so I didn't have the intimacy in my family that I really, I didn't know I wanted. Like, I
mm.
just didn't understand why sometimes it didn't feel right to be in my family. and
A
and
common experience, really. Yes. Yeah.
yeah. And so when I started to date, I didn't choose people who were able to create an intimate relationship.
Yeah.
And so those types of folks, they'll wander off.
Mm,
And and if you're not intimately connected with someone, like
mm,
oftentimes, you know, there can be a lot of pain associated with that. And so I ended up getting divorced, and my husband and I owned a business together, and I lost like over $60,000. And like back then that was like a lot of money.
and it's still a lot of money, but yes,
Yeah,
I
it's still
certainly hear
nothing to
you.
sneeze at, right? But
Yeah.
like, I mean, I was just devastated. And he ended up marrying my friend, and I was like in her belly dance troupe, which was like the big thing back then. And it was
Mm,
like a passion of mine that I wanted to pursue. And so like I love, and then I had a, stepson with him. And so like I had all of these layers of loss
mm,
with no ability to be able to process. And I didn't
mm,
even make it into a therapist's office until like 2 years after the the whole thing went down. And so, and then when I showed up, I was like completely ignorant of what I'm supposed to be doing in therapy.
Yes, you need to learn to work with a therapist, certainly. Well, yeah, that's an extraordinary amount of loss. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to be devastated,
Mm.
and that would be a huge amount to take in or to figure out how to let go of. I absolutely hear that distress.
And
Can you
I was
describe
just
what your behavior was like day to day? How were you? What were your days looking like at that point?
I was 35, managing a professional career. I was faculty, trying to show up every day and like do my job. I mean, one of the real problems with depression, grief, using alcohol misuse, those types of things, is that you're not fully present for
Yeah.
everything, And so faculty jobs, they have like two, well, you have many jobs tucked into one job, right? But there is the things you need to do to keep everything moving forward on a day-to-day basis. And then there's the long-term things that set your career, the writing grants, the writing papers, the really like the things that take 7, 8 months,
Mm,
to do. I fully lost my capacity to do those long-term planning things because I was holding it together over here and that was it.
mm,
And so part of that loss included getting let go from that faculty position.
mm. Okay. Yep. Another loss. Yep. Okay.
Huge.
Yeah. And did you feel uncomfortable in your own skin at that time?
Oh yeah.
What was it like to be you?
I say I felt uncomfortable in my skin, but I don't think I spent any time in my skin.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
was very detached. And I
Yes.
think that's one of the reasons that I could use alcohol to numb my pain,
Mm,
because I wasn't paying attention to the damage that I was doing to myself. I wasn't aware that I was self-harming with my drinking.
mm,
Until I ran across this self-compassionate research, and
mm,
I started like kind of assessing like what's going on for me, like how far am I away from this thing that I want to be, right? Turns
mm.
out a really long ways.
Sure. And were you living alone and then you had a housemate? And did that,
yes, I was living alone, and then I took on a housemate, and she was, I think, really the only person that even, I mean, I'm sure people knew that I drank a lot. Like, I had a lot of friends that drank a lot. It was pretty normalized, but
Mm.
she was the one who was aware that it was not serving me.
Yep.
And, and she made a comment to me, and I was like, woof, not happy with her, right? Like, clearly you are misguided.
Mm.
But on the inside, I was like, oh shit, somebody realizes what's happening,
Mm.
I'm busted. But
Yeah, a useful mirror. Yes. Yep.
it still took me several months before I really internalized that and was able to get myself into rehab.
Okay. Yep. Now that takes a lot of determination. Yeah. So that sounds like a really big turning point to see that there was a problem and go, "Ooh, wow, I need to do something here."
Yeah. It's like layers of awareness there,
Mhm.
because I knew things were not going well. I knew I wasn't able to get my long-term goals met. I knew I was desperately unhappy.
Mm.
Things just didn't seem to be working out for me. It's like I didn't see the problem clearly. And I think
Mm.
that's part of having any kind of mental challenge, is that your brain is literally damaged. And so you're trying to use a brain that is has some challenges to it to try to solve problems. And sometimes you're just too far in it, and
Mm.
you need a little handout.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, termination is one thing, but you need some support, some guidance, some new skills, some
Yeah.
insight.
And
Yep, all that.
I laugh about myself a lot. I tell people, especially I work with women in recovery a lot because they're, lovely people. And I tell them, like, if you think you could have thought yourself out of it, like, let me tell you, like, I had a neuroscience background and I was working in behavior change, and I could not think myself out of it. So what are the ideal things that you could have, right? That you think you could think yourself out of that problem? I think I had it, and I couldn't
Yes.
do it.
Yep. Yep. Fair enough. You mentioned that you did the training in self-compassion. And when we'd spoken before today, you'd mentioned that an instructor had modeled a compassionate inner voice for you, a nurturing voice, and that you'd never heard that before. Can you just talk about what that was like and what
This
that
this was
moment was like?
the birth of my company, basically. And so what happened was, at this point, I think it was maybe 2015, I had been studying self-compassion. I started studying 2013, and taking courses 2014, teacher training 2015. And so I had, because of my research background, I had read every single research paper on self-compassion, which you could do
Yes.
back then. I'm not
Yes.
sure you could do that today. There's so much out there. And I had read like Dr. Kristen Neff's book, and like she was like the premier researcher in the area. And so I really kind of thought I knew it all. And I was kind of kicked back in teacher training, like, let's get this over with. Like, I'm ready to get the certificate and start teaching this. And that's when she modeled her inner voice for me. And it sounded like, oh, darling, I'm so sorry you're having to go through this. This is so hard. And I just remember sitting in the back of the class, and my brain was like, what?
Mm.
You are allowed to speak to yourself that way? Like,
Mm.
I had no kind inner voice.
Mm.
No nurturing inner voice. No, like, my inner voice at best was like, I guess you don't suck today. Like, it was really bad. And I had no awareness of it until
Mm.
that moment. And so, when she was talking about that inner voice, it actually, that was the birth. It sounded to me like a grandmother, like
Okay. Yes. Yes. Yep.
everybody's best qualities of their grandmother mixed together, like the grandmother avatar who's so
Mm.
nurturing and loving and kind. And so that was the very first inner ally that was born that day.
Yeah, and I imagine a lot of us have a parental sort of inner critic, inner voice that we're not really aware of it because we've heard it for so many years as a little kid. We don't really realize as an adult that it's now us creating that, and that maybe we could change that or reprogram it, or think about even notice and have awareness about what is that voice, what are we saying to ourselves, how do we talk to ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can see how powerful that would be. I mean, so often we aren't aware of that. Okay. So you wanted to found InnerAlly, and just tell us about what you're doing there.
Sure. Well, the core of InnerAlly is just exactly what that story talked about, which is how do you speak to yourself on the inside? And so once I realized the problem that I had was that I had no compassionate inner voice. All of my inner voices were like a bully, a judge, a critic, like they were all the things that were really harsh. And so I started creating, like, I was really inspired by this idea of the grandmother, like, and that as a really nurturing and kind voice. And so that kind of created all of these different characters in my mind, because one of the problems with self-compassion at the time that I was being taught it, there were literally only white middle-aged women in the room. So it was not being taught in any way that was diverse, or like, it wasn't selling, if you will. And the reason it needs to is because everyone needs self-compassion. It's not a middle-aged white woman thing, right? And so I wanted to see if I could create these characters that would be able to kind of reach across the different demographics and age and race, and see if we could get some conversations going about, how to treat yourself internally. And so I kind of started looking at a framework for like how we support ourselves and what kind of emotional needs that we have. I found the schema therapy framework for core emotional needs, and that it was really got me going, because it gave me some categories, which are basically like each of the InnerAlly superpowers. And so in my system, I have a questionnaire that you can take, that you can assess yourself and find out which inner allies you actually need some guidance from. And so the system works so well that I can put somebody through this questionnaire, and then all I have to do is kind of show them their data, and they immediately are like, oh, I see myself in that data. And here's how it's showing up in my life right now. And then what we can do is we create customized language for that person, so that they have something to say to themselves in their moment of need, in that moment of struggle or suffering or frustration, whatever that looks like on the inside for them.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that would be powerful. And also just the insight of starting to understand yourself and a bit of your background, I suppose, of where those voices came from. And then shifting that to saying, what are the voices I need to hear? Or who are some of the positive voices I've had, I suppose, in my life as well. And just assessing all those things and turning that into a positive package rather than one that's undermining you.
And I really liked using helpful and unhelpful. So your inner language is in one of those two buckets.
Yep.
It's very rarely neutral.
Yes. Okay. Yep. Yep.
I
And
mean,
this is quite a different thing than dealing with people who've got schizophrenia or intrusive thoughts, those sorts of voices. You're not dealing with that.
Excellent point, Jean. Yeah, this isn't really about intrusive thoughts. It's really more about ruminating thoughts or worry thoughts, or those recurring thoughts that you have when you're depressed. You don't have to have any kind of mental disease or disorder to be able to benefit from using compassionate inner language, because it's really comes out of the world of positive psychology, which means you don't have to be sick to get better.
That makes a great deal of sense. Yep, got you. And how do you work with people? What are some of the choices if somebody is hearing this and going, hey, yes, I realize I've got an inner voice that's not supporting me. What are the different ways they might work with you?
Well, I do one-on-one coaching quite a bit with people. And it's interesting because the problems that people come to me with are very broad and different. But the core is when they look at my marketing and they see themselves in my marketing and that how they're treating themselves, right? It tends to be people who are like perfectionists, worriers, the overgivers, I would say like the people who tend to be a little like towards addictive personality type of the thing. And what they all have in common is usually some kind of childhood trauma or some kind of trauma that they've had in their life. And it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just anytime, like, you don't get to my age and not have trauma, right? Like trauma is a very common
Sure.
thing.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
I'm not talking PTSD, right? Which is like a diagnosable set of symptoms. I'm talking about like a traumatic event happened and then you change the way who you are and how you think about yourself for the rest of your life. Like that's what I'm talking about with trauma. And so you can have the best parents in the world and you always end up with some kind of trauma.
Yes. Sure. Well, hey, thank you very much for being here. Anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I would just encourage people to spend a little time assessing your own thoughts. One of the ways that you can do that is that you can use your little smartphone and you can set like a few alarms during your day and just check in with yourself. How are you relating to yourself? And I think it can be really helpful to kind of get a baseline of, are you worried when that little alarm goes off? What are you saying to yourself? Like how, what kind of emotions are happening? And then you can begin to think about like, oh, what is it that I really want to shift? And oftentimes this inner language, it seems like a nice to have, but when you look at people and where they are now and where they want to be in their future, if you don't sort out this inner language thing, it's really hard to get to where you want to be because you'll hold yourself back through the process. And so I really want to encourage people to assess their own inner language and get out there and learn about self-compassion. Come take my questionnaire, take some coaching. I always offer different types of classes right now. Every January, I like to do one around behavior change and it's called the gentle path to change. It's kind of the opposite of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's more of a compassionate and mindful and science-based way of getting change done.
Oh, that sounds terrific. Yep. Okay. We'll pass on the links to all that information. So thank you very much for coming. And it was delightful to spend this time with you.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Jean. Thank you so much.